and I'm going to start now because I'm mindful that I have a lot of material I want to get through, and uh, I also want to make sure that we have a chance to really discuss this material from the overriding perspective of narratives, looking at the Zionist narrative and the Palestinian narrative. So I want to make sure I leave plenty of time for that. And then to sort of finish it up with a little analysis. So today I'm focusing less on the ideas of nationalism, although we'll return to those ideas throughout the class today and in later classes. And I want to focus a lot more on the historical background leading up to the War of Independence, or the Nakba in 1948. We'll focus a lot on the experience of the Yeshuv, which is the Yiddish term used to refer to the Zionist community in Israel before the founding of Israel, and also the community of Palestinian Arabs as they emerge as a more self-consciously nationalist group. And we'll start right around the time of World War I, looking at events specifically in the Middle East amidst a crumbling Ottoman Empire and the subsequent imposition of a British mandate. Then we'll look at waves of Jewish immigration to Palestine, 5 different aliyot, as it's referred to, a Hebrew term that means to go up. Jewish people still refer to aliyah as when people from outside of Israel, Jewish people, move to Israel, they call it aliyah, to go up. So we'll look at those waves of Jewish immigration and how they contributed to a rising conflict in Palestine between the Yishuv and the Palestinian Arab community there. And then we'll sort of wrap that section of tonight's class up with looking at a comparative look at both the Jews and the Palestinians' efforts to develop state institutions prior to the founding of the State of Israel. And then we'll look at this effort to resolve the conflict, the growing conflict between Jews and Arabs in this area through partition plans. And that's where we'll sort of leave it. And then we'll flip to, different narrative approaches to understanding the Zionist and Palestinian. So as you're listening to this, and for sure ask questions if you need clarification, I want you to think, like, how does this appear to the Jews? How does this in Palestine in particular? And how does this also appear to the Palestinian Arabs? So let me share my screen so I've run, oh, that's not what you want to see. It's always funny, like every time I share my screen, something new is there that I didn't think was there before. It's like a surprise. This is what you get to see, my email. All right, here we are. So, and I may kind of like really go quickly over some of these slides just because they're not as important, but I wanted to put some information here. So, okay. Just to remind you, so this is what we'll look at in terms of this before Israel was a state. Palestinian Jewish society after the Ottoman Empire, World War I, and the British Mandate. And we'll look at several different, I'm sort of giving you the bird's eye picture, like from 30,000 feet, and then we'll get into it. At several points, British leadership engaged in duplicitous deal-making with leaders of the Jewish and Palestinian national movements. There's a correspondence between McMahon and Hussein promising the Palestinian leader an Arab caliphate, across in return for support for the British cause in fighting the Ottomans and in World War I. And then there's this very different and contradictory agreement, a secret agreement between Britain and France, Sykes-Picot, a year later, dividing up the Middle East and drawing boundaries for Syria and Lebanon and Transjordan and Palestine. And then there's the Balfour Declaration, which we talked at length about last week. And those promises from Britain, that's the critical thing here, sort of point in different directions, right? And both the Palestinian leadership and the Yishuv leadership are trying to figure out where Britain's true intentions are and whether they can depend upon Britain to protect them and their interests. And that occurs, while that is happening, of course, then there are Jews and Arabs are living together in Palestine. And Chaim Weizmann works to try to foster an agreement with the Emir Faisal in 1919 to permit Jewish homeland in Palestine in return for Jewish support of a large Arab caliphate, which is promptly rejected after it was agreed to. And then what I really want to sort of focus on here is how all of this surrounds growing violence in that area. Anti-Zionist protests, British reprisals, and that's a really important piece of this. So the conflict starts between Palestinian Arabs and Jews in the Middle East well before the founding of the State of Israel is what I want to say, first of all. And secondly, we want to also look at, well, what's happening in terms of the efforts of both these national movements to concretize what they're after. And we'll look at their parallel efforts to build institutions. And the punchline here is that the Zionists were way more successful for lots of reasons. Related to their willingness to compromise and work with the British, and also conversely the Palestinian leadership's unwillingness to do that, an unwillingness to compromise in this situation, which I want to unpack in greater detail when we get to that. This culminates in 1936 to 1939 with the Great Arab Revolt and the United Nations, the Peel Commission, which is a British commission, to try to divide up Palestine into a Jewish state and a Palestinian state, and then we're in World War II, which has a tremendous impact in reshaping this whole conflict. All right, so that's a lot to cover. So you'll see that's why I'm going fast. All right. So just want to remind you that Arab nationalism is already emerging. In the 19th century, in the middle of this decaying Ottoman Empire. At the same time, you're getting growing Western colonial influence in the same area. Arab nationalism is in a lot of ways formed in response to these two, in resistance to these two forms of dominion by the aging and falling and fading Ottoman Empire, right? So, like, if that's confusing to you, think about this: that the Ottomans really think about them as Turkish rule, Islamic Turkish rule. Arab identity and Islam identity and Arab national identity is formed in this early mid 19th century. In response, in a way to sort of assert a new identity. And that's what I was talking about at the end of class last week. Now, it's also in response to Western colonialism, as the British and the French and for that matter, even Russian forces are present, and American missionaries are becoming more and more of a presence in the Middle East, there's also a resistance to that as well. And Zionism, right? The particulars of Arab Zionism, of Palestinian nationalism, is forged in reaction not just to these two things, but also to Zionism, which is seen often as a arm of, or an extension of, British colonialism or Western colonialism more generally. So this is Muhammad Ali Pasha, and Muhammad Ali Pasha was sort of the Wali of Egypt under the Ottoman rule, and kind of was in charge of Palestine, and from 1831 to 1841. And during that period of time, there was a growing sense of Palestinian identity, even though the people living in that area wouldn't have called themselves Palestinian, but they were growing to see themselves as different and distinctive in culture, and in particular, their social practices from Egyptians and Syrians. And in 1834, the Palestinian Arab people revolted against Egyptian rule in 3 cities, in Jerusalem, Nablus, and Hebron. But the bigger push in terms of Arab nationalism in this period of time was really, I went the wrong way, was really a pan-Arab identity, the development of this, right? As the British took over the area following World War I and issued the Balfour Declaration, which we talked about last week, the response of the Palestinian people is less about saying, we are Palestinian, this is our country, but more about wanting to be united with a large Arab nation, the Arab nationalism centered around Syria. Okay. Now going back to the Egyptian occupation of Palestine, there was an economic impact as well. And they insisted that barter transactions had to be replaced by monetary transactions. This is a big change. And here's critical. Christians and Jews should be allowed to participate more freely in the economy and more generally. Now, all of this happened, and then the Ottoman Sultan reoccupied this land, forcing Ibrahim Pasha to give up the Levant, which is Palestine, which is Lebanon and Syria, essentially. So all of this is happening. Ottomans reasserting their authority. Palestine economy is starting to open up, become more integrated, more developed, cultural life before World War I. And now here comes the British. And the British are presenting a little problem for the Ottomans as they're becoming more and more militarily present in the region. This is before World War I, right? The Ottomans recognized this, and in 1839, right? So this is just a reminder of how gigantic the Ottoman Empire is and how difficult it is to run an empire that is so sprawling. So, and so we're just talking about this area here, and this is what I mean by the Levant, this area right here. Oftentimes going all the way up here, but again, and by the way, Levant is, I looked it up today. I was like, why do we refer to this as with a French word? It was the French thinking about, like, this is where the sun rises in the east, Levant, rise in the east. Okay, that's a little trivia for you. Okay, so the Ottomans see the British as a challenge to them. And they recognize that in such a large, far-flung empire, the people in different parts of the empire may start to grow in allegiance to the British. And so they decide to implement some reforms, the Tanzimat reforms. And this is the second half of the 19th century, right, before World War I. And part of this was basically first of all, this idea that everybody's going to be have rights, even the dhimmi identities of Christians and Jews, and this is followed up by edicts in 1856 and then in 1858 that allowed for private land ownership. Now, this is important. Palestinians had begun to invest in crops, cash crops, cotton, sesame, oranges, and they were starting to sell this to the British. So there's this Palestinian economy and land ownership by the time the First World War began. And who owns the land? This is critical, right? It's increasingly this group of urban notables and elite who are absentee landlords. They didn't live on the land. They lived in cities, right? They lived in Jerusalem. They lived in Haifa. They lived in Jaffa. And they owned all this land, and all these Palestinian Arabs who lived there kind of had no idea that this land was owned by somebody. I mean, they might have known that dimly, but what was really important was this was their neighborhood. This was their region, this Sanjak. There were people there. Now, Palestinians started to become more and more aware of them, of what's happening, because there's this, with the British being there and the French being there, the printing press is now available. And for the first time in the second part of the 19th century, you're reading Arabic newspapers all over the place, including Al-Quds, which is named after the Arab term for Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, and Al-Carmel, and then later Philistine, which is Palestine, right? These are really important newspapers. So people are starting to hear about the urban notables who own their land by reading their newspapers, and they're reading about what's happening with British conflicts with the Ottomans, and Jews are starting to increase in their population. Between 1895 and 1914, there's not a lot of Jews there, right? This is 40,000 people are coming in, and they're mostly coming into agricultural colonies. But even that amount of immigration leads to growing opposition to this new form of Jewish nationalism, Zionism, which we talked about last week. And in Al-Carmel and in the Philistine, those two newspapers, there's growing anti-Zionist articles, a lot more of that, warning that Zionism is a big danger to the Arab identity and to the Palestinian people. And it's being reprinted, not just in Palestine, but in the Syrian newspapers as well. And the thing, what they're really angry about at this point is that the Ottomans aren't controlling Jewish immigration. That's what the really big worry is. Right. Meanwhile, all right, so you've got this religious pluralism, you're getting an end to this friendliness between Jews and Arabs who live in Palestine, because as Zionism becomes this clearer nationalist identity, and you've got increasing numbers of Jews there, Arabs are starting to get frustrated. But they're also frustrated, and this was a point I wanted to make last week, they're even more frustrated about Christians during the 19th century. Those Christians are seen as the bigger threat until we get Zionism at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. The other point I want to make here is that unlike European colonial empire, governments, in Palestine and in Jerusalem, the political power is held by families who had a history on that land in the rural areas. And in cities, it's like in Jerusalem, it's the Muslim hierarchy. It's not the same kind of political identification that we see in European countries. And by the way, when the Zionists, when the Yishuv starts in, they have a very different style of politics, right? They're electing, committee leadership. They have political parties. They have labor councils, all of that kind of stuff. This is different. And I just want to contrast sort of the tone, the political tone is quite different in Arab Palestine. And it's really disconnected from the people who really have control over the land or the economy. Okay. Before I move on to Jewish immigration, any comments or questions about what I've talked about so far? I won't be able to see. I can't, it's very hard for me to follow the chat as well as keep track of what I want to say here. So if you've got something to say.
Can I ask a question, Scott? It's Rosalie.
Sure, please.
So I'm somewhere on your screen. Who were the urban notables that you had mentioned?
Well, that's a great question. These are people who typically had a position of authority under the Ottomans. They were tax collectors mainly.
They were Arabs. Okay.
Yeah, these are Arab notables who had power, and they had some position. Typically, they were tax collector in Palestine for the Ottoman Empire, and so they had a connection there. Or they were a Muslim cleric, also recognized by the Ottomans at some point. And so, even though they may not really have any really intense allegiance to the Ottoman Empire or have a lot of connection, that's where they got launched, right? That's how they got their power. And there's a lot of inequality, right? There's a lot of peasants who don't really have anything, and then there are these landowners who have, who are living in Jerusalem and Haifa and Jaffa and Jaffa, who really do have a lot.
It's Debbie. I have a quick question. Mm-hmm. Was Egypt its own country or part of the Ottoman territory?
Egypt was was occupied territory, colonial occupation, but before that, was it part of the Ottoman Empire? No, it was not part of the Ottoman Empire. It was independent prior to all of this. Yeah, it was its own entity, and I don't really know my history about Egypt prior to this.
I was just curious because you had mentioned a conflict with Egypt, and that was all. Okay.
Yeah, no. I don't remember what Egypt conflict I mentioned, but you can see it here.
Yeah. Okay.
Right? Parts of Egypt are, Cairo is, right? But this whole area here, and yeah. I mean, I guess it's pretty much under the Ottoman rule.
Okay.
For the most part.
Oh, you said the Palestinians revolted against Egypt, and that's...
Oh, right. Okay. Oh, right. Egypt ended up having a position, Egyptian control of Palestine, and under the Ottoman Empire, they let the Wali of Egypt was sort of running Palestine for a while, just for 10 years.
Okay.
Before Ottomans came back in and imposed themselves. As they were losing control, I mean, the bigger point here is that as the Ottomans are kind of losing control of this area and things are opening up, and now you're using money and currency, and people are buying land. The Ottomans realize as they take back control that they need to, if they're going to compete for the allegiance of the people who live in this area, they need to open up their society somewhat, which is that Tanzimat set of principles.
Okay.
Michael Kafka would like to say something.
Please.
Okay, you indicated that I'd like to call them the Jordanians were complaining that the Turkish were not controlling the Jewish immigration. And the reason for it is because the Jews, via the Jewish National Fund, were buying the land from the Turkish owners in Istanbul and working their land, which they owned. That is why the complaint was not valid. As a matter of fact,
absolutely, very important, Michael. Right, what with the Tanzimat principles, that like in the latter part of the 19th, early part of the leading into 20th century, they opened up the possibility for people to purchase land. So not only were the Arabs who lived in that area, whether they call them Jordanians or Palestinian Arabs, whatever we called them at this point,
right,
they were complaining not only about the numbers of Jews coming, but that also the Jews were buying up this land. But they were being sold the land by Palestinian notables who were in trouble economically. And they had this land. They didn't care about the land. They just sold it. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Michael. I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
I think that's it. Keep going, Scott. This is great.
Okay. All right. So now
Scott, can I ask a quick question? This is Jim.
Please, Jim.
So I know there's this idea of this pan-Arab identity, but if you were to put yourself in Jerusalem at this period, right? I don't know if you call it at this period, and you talk to the guy in the marketplace, would he say he was Syrian? There was no Jordan, so he wasn't Jordanian.
No, he would say I'm
Palestinian. What is he? Would he say I'm an Arab?
He'd say I'm from this Sanjak. I'm from this area. I'm from Jerusalem, or I'm from, and I don't know all the names of the Sanjaks, but these regions, these land areas, that's what they would say. They would say, I'm from here. This is where I'm from. They might say they're also Arab, right? But yeah, that there was this concept of, nation state was sort of a vague idea.
Thank you.
Yeah. Which doesn't, by the way, I want to be clear what I'm saying by that. I'm not saying that form of nationalism isn't a connection to this space of this land with a cultural, economic, political history to it. It's just defined in a very different way than European nationalism. And it's like the Zionists are well ahead of that in terms of speaking in those ways and thinking in that way, because they're from Europe, most of the Zionists, as we're going to see. And as they're coming in there, they're already thinking in terms of the state and the nation. So, pogroms in Eastern Europe, growing effort. This is kind of ironic, as Jews are more and more assimilated in Western Europe, they are also becoming more and more aware of how excluded they are. Upper middle class Jews are becoming more aware of how, right, it's kind of like glass ceiling almost, right? And this is when Herzl's 1896, The Jewish State, is published, and in 1897, I'll come to this in a minute, there you have the first World Zionist Organization. Now, Jews are starting to immigrate to Palestine, and most Jews who are trying to get out of Europe don't want to go to Palestine. They want to go to the United States. They want to go to Canada. Some are going to South America, but some who are more, or driven by the dream of being in the Jewish homeland, are coming to Palestine. So you get this first, by the end of the 19th century, you get this first immigration wave into Palestine, mostly into cities.
Were they religious Jews or?
Combination, right? Mostly the first Aliyah, right? Between 1890 and the beginning of World War I, you got 75,000, 85,000 going into Palestine. The first earliest part of it is in the first Aliyah. I'll show it to you in a minute, right? You got immigrants, mostly are Russian Jews, who are just getting out of the shtetl. They're running, right? And so if they're not coming to the United States or Europe, they're if they get to Palestine, right? And some of their, but the second Aliyah, and I can say a little bit more about this, is some of these are sort of, I mean, everybody's religious, right? In that time, in terms of Jews, that's how it's hard to separate culture and identity from religious identity. I mean, there was no conservative Judaism, Reform Judaism, let's put it that way, right? But they're coming, and now, but here's where you start to see a split, right? In the second Aliyah, before World War I still, you get another 40,000 are coming from Tsarist Russia, and they're bringing with them their socialist ideas, right? Those folks are decidedly not religious, right? Because socialism, Marxism, and they're establishing the first kibbutzim. And for those of you who are not familiar with the kibbutz, these were small agricultural socialist communities where all property was mutually shared. And there were sort of the idea, these were idyllic communities focused on principles of equality, full equality, but one of the things was they were trying to create a new Jew. The new Jew, this second wave, was not the Jew that was religious or wasn't allowed to own land or work land and was always called the middleman or the money-grubbing Jew, those stereotypes in Europe, right? Because Jews were not permitted to own land or work land, when they came to Palestine, they were committed that they were going to work the land. And this was really, really important to them. They were going to have a connection to the land, as well as these other equality ideas. I see Harvey's raising his hand. Go ahead.
Oh,
you got to unmute yourself. No? Okay. That's all right.
And I just want to say one thing, just from a little research I've done when I was preparing for my Na'amat talk. The distinction, when you look at the first Aliyah, think of Tevye, think of Anatevka. Everybody was Orthodox. It was just the very dawn of these radical ideas that really took root in the next 10, 20 years. But these were religious people. They weren't going to start a fanatic Jewish. They were just religious, and they were going to live in Israel and live religiously. No feminists, no equality. Women weren't looking for new rights. It was, they got a window, by the way, all the women got a window into how different their lives were, even as Western religious people, than Middle Eastern women, how not oppressed they were. Just a fascinating little sociological twist on that. But anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just wanted to interject that.
No, that's so interesting. I never thought about that. Right. So yeah, so there's this, like, they're coming into a new place, but it's the second group that's much more ideological, right? These are the socialist kibbutz, secular, right? Zionists. The third Aliyah, you got more pogroms, and you got another 40,000 more Jews, mostly Eastern European Jews coming in. Now, I'm going to take you all the way through, and we'll go back to in the history in a minute, but I wanted to show you, right? So we got another wave of Jews coming in, and this is a different group, but much larger, right? Twice as large. Before World War II, between the war and the interwar period. These are middle-class Jews coming out of Germany and Eastern Europe, Poland, and they're trying to get away from anti-Semitism in Poland. And here's what's really critical. The United States in 1924 shuts down immigration from pretty much everywhere except for Western Europe, which nobody wanted to come anymore from Britain to the United States. I mean, the 1924 Immigration Act imposed racial quotas in the United States, and we turned away any ships from Italy, from Ireland. That was really focused on the Irish and the Italians and the Jews too. And so Jews who wanted to get the heck out of, like, their things are getting worse and worse and worse. And now they got to go to Palestine. That's where they can go. And then, of course, with the rise of the Nazi Party and the laws that were passed right away that says, you can't marry a Jew, and the Jews are kind of getting the picture really quickly, whereas the rest of the world isn't so quickly. And you got 250,000 Jews leaving Europe. Right? I mean, this is huge. Just from 1933 to 1936, those 3 years, 174,000 Jews go into Palestine. And they bring the Jewish population up to 450,000. So from the perspective of the Palestinians, what do you think their experience of this is?
I don't like it.
Go ahead.
They're overwhelmed.
Right, all these Jews are coming in, and they're buying, as Michael pointed out correctly, they're buying up land for the Jews to farm. And what was the position of the agriculture is that we don't want any Arabs farming this land because we have to have a connection to the land because we're the new Jew. This is an ideological thing. It's not really anti-Arab. It's just a vision of what the Zionist secular socialist Jew is. And so when you put all that together, you can see how this is starting to, impact the relationship in Palestine, which is a small place between the Arabs and the Jews there. Okay.
Daddy, Karen has her hand raised.
Oh, please, Karen, go ahead. Thank you. I can't see.
Oh, it's okay. There's just a little. I just wanted to clarify. You probably mentioned it before. Was it? You used the word Palestine. I know Israel hasn't been officially created yet. Did all Jews, everybody refer to the land as Palestine? Was it just universally no? Did everybody, all the Jews coming in, did they refer to it as Palestine? Did they all refer to it? Was that the common name for it?
I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to what your question is. I do know it started to be referred to as Palestine when Britain, with the Sykes-Picot Agreement that I'm about to tell you, right? But some people definitely did, right? I think, a lot of people looked at the map and it was labeled on Western maps, Palestine.
Yeah.
So
Scott, Michael's hand is up.
Okay, please. I can't see everybody because if I look at everybody, then I can't look at my slides.
Okay. Michael would like to point out that unlike the Europeans who invaded the Americas and by force took it over, the Jews did not have an army. They came in peacefully and while buying the land to which they came from. They were returning home.
Right.
So 2 reasons to distinguish it from colonialism in traditional sense. They did not come by force. They bought the land on which they settled, okay? And it was their ancestral homeland.
Yeah, thank you.
Which is a great articulation, Michael, a great articulation of the Zionist narrative. And I really want us to be clear. And I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm not disagreeing with that approach, by the way. I'm not at all saying that. But I am saying that that's the way the Zionists saw it. We're getting out away from harsh, anti-Semitic life, and we're going to Palestine, which we've been praying about in our Sidurim for our great-great-great-grandparents were talking about it. This has been in our literature. Jerusalem is part of our life, right? And Jews have been there, right? Steadily, continuously, all this time, right? Absolutely.
Scotty,
But the other, I'm going to come to I see a couple of hands, but the other question I laid out there a minute ago was what's right. Marcia said they're overwhelmed, but let's unpack this a little bit. What is the Palestinian narrative of what's happening here? Karen, I don't want to side.
Yeah, just very quickly. I just want to clarify. You mentioned that the Jews were coming in and they were buying land. So the Palestinians. Sorry, I'm going to be going down into dark regions here. Palestinians were already there. Who were they buying the land for? How did they negotiate? How were they buying the land? Who were they buying the land from?
Well, that's a great question. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it's a fascinating topic.
I know.
A great book by Kenneth Stein about this. It's wonderful. But let me just say it very quickly. Okay. There was a downturn in the economy, and with the fall of the Ottoman Empire, there's a lot of notables who had their wherewithal. Right, the elites that I was talking about, the Palestinians who are living in cities who are absentee landlords, were losing money, right? And they needed to maintain themselves. So one thing they had was land, and Jews didn't have a lot of money, but there was an international effort led by people like Chaim Weizmann to create a bank for the Jews to buy land in Palestine that could be used to set up this promised homeland that came in the Balfour Declaration. So it was complicated, but the Ottomans had okayed it, and the Arab press was saying this is horrible, right? So you can see it right here. Ottoman policy says that Jews can go wherever they want. They have outside it, right? But they have to submit to the laws. And in Palestine, the idea was, well, we'll just get around this. There wasn't a lot of attention to Palestine, believe it or not. The Arab Commission in Jerusalem, which was headed by the Mufti, the Muslim cleric, the head chief Muslim official, started to say in 1897, the same year that the World Zionist Organization established, had its first meeting in Basel, Switzerland, a commission to start to look at the issue of land sales to Jews. But a lot of the criticism of Zionism was that they're buying up all of our land. Yes, go ahead, Robin. You've been patiently waiting. I'm sorry.
No problem. So, you were asking, what is what would possibly be the Palestinian perspective on this? And, clearly they're seeing this as those damn Jews. The Jews are buying up everything. They're coming here, they're taking over. But as I'm listening, Scott, to what you're talking about, it's interesting to me because, this is the Ottoman. These are the Turks who are allowing it to happen. And it's, the British who are allowing it to happen. And how can you look at how would you look at this as a group of people who are literally seeking asylum someplace because their lives and their livelihoods are being threatened somewhere else. And why are why would the Palestinians blame them? Again, it's a very, I think I'm just taking a very Western European, or maybe just a very, given my bleeding heart liberal values, I'm just having a hard time understanding why they would be looking at this and not doing, I guess, what I call a root cause analysis, as opposed to, it just screams anti-Semitism to me.
Well, okay, this Debbie.
Well, let me just say that
Okay.
I think you make some really important points. I will say that the Arabs who are living there perceived this in part as they were there in their neighborhoods, and when the population gets very large of Western European Jews who are saying, you can't work our land. Wait, this was our land. They don't understand, like, this idea of land ownership is a new idea, fairly new. And by the way, they didn't feel that they owned the land. It was some other person, and some well-known, notable. And so all of a sudden the Jews are saying, well, this is our land, you got to get off, because in this one area, this farm, because we're going to farm it. But they also really saw this as a part and parcel of Western colonialism. And they're reading, about efforts to oppose anti-colonial movements elsewhere. So it's complicated. Now, World War I kind of pushes us into another realm, because when World War I breaks out in 1914, it helped both the Zionists and the Arabs in connecting to the British Empire. First of all, economic conditions in Palestine and in the Ottoman Empire become horrible. Thousands of Jews are expelled from Palestine, from Jaffa, from Tel Aviv. The population of Jews was reduced in 1914. It started at 85,000 in 1914. By the end of 1917, it was 56,000. The Arab population also declined in Palestine by about 100,000 people during that same time. So it's pretty awful. The Great War gave Zionists a chance at the same time to prove themselves, to prove their strategic utility to Britain. First of all, the Yishuv provided spies for Britain who wanted to defeat the Ottomans. And outside of Palestine, Zionists were volunteering to fight for the British, and they formed a Jewish military transport unit. Chaim Weizmann, right? It was like the leader of the Zionist movement in Europe, got a lot of his in with the British leadership because he had come up with this way to make better bombs, right? Fast, more deadly bombs. And so that made him, and plus he was incredibly charming, as I mentioned, and very skillful diplomatically. So now, but what's really interesting for the Arabs, there's this, the Ottomans were allied with Germany against the Allied powers. And British were fighting a war in the Middle East because they were the bigger colonial power there against the Ottoman Empire. And so they wanted to get an Arab leader in Palestine to help them against the Ottomans. And they turned to Sharif Hussein to stage a revolt that would cut off the Ottomans' supply lines, threaten their flanks, because and also to force the Ottomans to divert troops away from their main conflict to all the way down into Palestine. So two things that came out of this, right, is that Sharif Hussein is now elevated, and Hussein is connected to, if you've seen Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, and other little British military and political leaders that would help. And this relationship between Sharif Hussein and the British was going to help the British for years as they're trying to figure out how to govern in this area. Yes, Michael.
Yes, I have to make this very important comment. Your first bullet on this slide says Yishuv provided spies for Britain. There is a story that when I found out about it about 5 years ago, I was floored. I cannot believe it. In that time, is correct, the Jewish the Yishuv provided some spies to the British, and the Turks found out about it, and they decided to do the same thing as they did to the Armenian, and do a Holocaust on the Jewish Palestinian Jews in Israel. Who do you think, of all people, saved the Yishuv in Israel?
I have no idea. I didn't know about that.
The Vatican and the German government intervened to save the Jews in Israel from the same calamity that happened to the Armenians.
Really?
Absolutely. It is the most incredible story. I'll tell you more about it, give you some links later.
Okay. Fascinating. So you can see here that for Britain's importance in the arena is helpful to both the Jews and the Palestinian leadership. So with World War I, we got the Ottoman Empire on the side of Germany.
Mm-hmm.
You've got Russia, Britain, and France declaring war against both Germany and the Ottoman Empire. They're trying to figure out what's going to happen to the Ottoman land after this war is over, and when it seems like that the Ottomans are going to be defeated. They were already weak before this, so this seems kind of clear. So the British want to get the Russians out of this. So they concede to Russia. I'll show you in the map in a minute. Up north above the Black Sea, right? The Bosphorus Straits, Dardanelles Mountains. And Russia says, okay, we'll stand down. We'll let Britain and France kind of divvy up the rest of the Ottoman lands. There's a commission, a committee that the British Empire, the very first one, the De Bunsen Committee, that says, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to divide this up? So you can imagine like all these Western leaders in London, right, trying to figure out what's going to happen to hundreds of thousands of Arabs living in this area for hundreds of years under Ottoman rule. And they're going to figure out who's going to control what. And their original plan says, okay, French will get this, Britain will get that. I'll show you some more details in a minute. Palestine should be, right, we don't want to have a fight over these religious sites. So we're going to just, right, the Christians are going to care too much. The Pope is going to, right, the Vatican's going to be too concerned with. So we're just going to make it an international area. And we're not going to let the French move down from the Levant, Lebanon into Palestine and take over. Now, meanwhile, so the British has promised already to, starts to make these promises to Sharif Hussein to try to keep him and some Arab military forces on their side against the Ottomans in this area. We're still in World War I, right? And the British High Commissioner for the area, Sir Henry McMahon, is writing back and forth a series of letters to the Sharif of Mecca, the religious leader, right, Sharif Hussein, between 1915 and 1916. And what does it say? Basically, Britain basically says there's one giant Arab caliphate that runs all the way up northern Africa, all the way through the Arabian Peninsula into the Levant, and we'll accept all of that. Palestine is not really directly mentioned in these letters, but the district, the Wilaya, which is the Arab word for district of Damascus, which includes part of Palestine, was to belong to that future Arab kingdom. We're not really clear what it means. That's the other point of this. It's kind of ambiguous. So this is happening between, right, this very high level British High Commissioner in Middle East and the Sharif of Mecca. And they're making all these promises after the this Arab, to try to get him to, stage this Arab revolt, to draw out the Ottomans away from the main stage of the conflict militarily. And 2 days later, as McMahon is, it's reported that he writes to the Foreign Office in Britain saying that he doesn't really mean the areas that are being promised to France on the northern coast of Syria or any of those areas. And in fact, he says a couple days later, I didn't really intend for Palestine to be included because the Debunson Committee had said that should be internationalized. So he's talking out of both sides of his mouth. That's the main thing here, right? And so you can see, then there's the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And this is really of 1916, which completely contradicts McMahon's letters to Hussein. And basically, this is a secret agreement signed on January 3rd of 1916 by the first secretary of the French embassy in London, Francois Georges Picot, and Sir Mark Sykes, the war minister, and Horatio Kitchener's he's also his personal representative. He's the war minister for the Middle East. And Britain and France basically sit down, these two officials, and they just divide up the Middle East into spheres of influence and areas of direct control. And in that moment, they draw the borders of Syria, of Lebanon, of Transjordan, and of Palestine. So France gets unconditional authority in sort of southern Syria, southwest Syria. I'm trying to describe it for you. Cilicia, it's called, coastal Syria, Lebanon. And they get a sphere of influence in the middle of Syria and Mosul. So that the sphere of influence means that nobody else can take over that area without France agreeing to work with them, and that ultimately this area is going to be ultimately turned over directly to the people who live there. But the direct influence means that France is running it, okay? Now Britain gets unconditional authority in Baghdad, Basra, a sphere of influence in Jordan, Transjordan. They also get these cities of Acre and Haifa, but the rest of Palestine is supposed to be under international administration. So this is what's happening with the former Ottoman Empire, right? The European powers are deciding what's going to happen. And it's really, if you're confused, just think about how the people who live there are feeling. That's exactly what's happening. Now, right, here's another way to look at it. You can see this is where the British are kind of ruling. This is where the French are. This is international, right? You can see over here, this is where the Russians have some control. Well, meanwhile, a year later, you got a new prime minister. You've got a Russian Revolution that's changing the way Britain and France are looking at Russia. The Bolsheviks have come to power, communist revolution. The British are thinking that they really need the United States to come into World War I. And European Jews are under threat. And there's growing feeling about this and awareness of this, including by David Lloyd George. And this is when you get this Lord Arthur Balfour, he's the British Foreign Secretary, declaring a commitment of Britain to a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine on November 17th, which is hugely significant to the Zionists. This is the first time you see a recognition from European powers that that the Jews have a right to a homeland in Palestine. And there's a couple of interesting features before I talk about Chaim Weizmann. But I'll just say this about Chaim Weizmann, that he's really the force behind this, right? He later goes on to become the first president of Israel, and he's doing this intense lobbying behind the scenes. And he's doing it. Here's how he does it, right? He says, look, Palestine is now something that's vitally important to you, Britain. It's a strategic asset for you to guard that Suez Canal, right? And if you, right, so how are you going to control Palestine with an Arab population that has no allegiance and no history with you? You bring Jews there, right? Russia would stay in the war. That's a big part of what Weizmann is trying to do, is a way to persuade Britain that he is their indispensable diplomat, and that he's also going to get the United States to enter this war. Now, what's another piece of that I wanted to highlight was that in the Balfour Declaration, it's kind of little print here, but you'll see that there was a big debate about whether it should say that there should be a Jewish home in Palestine or a national home of the Jewish people in Palestine. And of won out, right? Because they wanted to back away from this idea, which seemed too threatening and potentially would sink the whole deal, of that the Jews want a state there. They want a country there. So now they're just saying, no, we just want to have a home there, which is a soft version of that. So I read it to you before, but I did want to remind you one more time that it says here that nothing shall be done, the second part, nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. And one of the concerns of Palestinian advocates or Arab advocates is that there's no political rights mentioned. It's just civil and religious rights. And they're not even mentioned by name, right? They're this called non-Jewish communities, right? That this is evidence, this Balfour Declaration, to them, that the British Empire is now siding, with the Jews in this area of the world, and they're going to establish this Jewish home there, and that with all these immigrants coming in, that there's this concern that, oh my gosh, they are really going to just have a state, right? They're going to have a country here. All right, so now Weizmann also recognizes that this could be a bitter pill to swallow for Arabs, and as I said last week, he went over to Amir Faisal to strike a deal that basically the essence of the deal is that the Jews will help establish an Arab caliphate, and the British he'll get the British to back that, and that but that Jews should have unlimited immigration into Palestine, and that Jews should be able to have their home in Palestine. But in return, Jewish money, Jewish diplomatic support, Jewish know-how will be a force for this establishment of this Arab caliphate. So Amir Faisal, Syrian president, signs off on this, right? And then later, when it becomes known to other Arab leaders that he did that, he says, no, I never did that. I never acknowledged because he was basically recognizing the Balfour Declaration as okay. And then he turns around and says, no, I never did this. Instead, he calls for Palestine to be part of a greater Syria, part of this Arab caliphate. And he calls for an end to Jewish immigration. Okay. So all of this is happening. Sykes-Picot, McMahon, Hussein, and the British have basically set up everybody, right? They promised the Jews that they're going to have a homeland here. They promised the Arabs that they're going to have all of it to them. They're right, and then you know, Weizmann's trying to get the one Arab leader to cooperate, and all of it's really about helping the British win the war. The war is over, and the League of Nations is set up, and in the 14 points of the League of Nations, it emphasizes the right to self-determination. This is what's happening at the end of the war, and yet the victors of that war have now taken over the Ottoman territories, and they've set up this mandate system. What is the mandate system? Well, it's really a temporary system by Western colonial powers to run these areas with this sort of the supposition hidden in it that you know, Egyptian people, Algerian people, Iraqi people, they can't run their own government. They're not able to. So we'll teach them, and we'll have a mandate where we'll govern there for now, and we'll encourage these people, right, the Great White Hope, to develop their own political, economic, and social institutions of democracy, to have self-government. And then once they get there, when we think it's good, we'll remove ourselves. Now, there is a group of Class A mandates that were provisionally independent, but the British Empire, the French Empire will give some administrative advice and assistance. So this is the mandate system, and this is how the British mandate gets set up. But first, it has to be okayed not just by Mr. Sykes and Mr. Picot, but by the international powers. In San Remo Conference of 1920, they recognize basically the outlines of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, giving France mandatory rights in Syria, southern Syria, and Lebanon. Britain running Palestine, but it has to provide a home for the Jews because of the Balfour Declaration. And the League of Nations ratifies this, right? So now the international community says this, including the Balfour Declaration. Faisal, Syria is immediately taken over by the French. As I mentioned last week, British help him out and put him in Iraq. So, right, here's the map of the ultimate determination of the Middle East, right? This is the British Empire right here in the Middle East, and here's where Palestine is. Okay, another. Now, I'm recognizing that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to get fast here a little bit. Couple things, right? So now immigration is starting to heat up, and the first violent outbreaks or protests by Arabs in Palestine started in 1920. 5 Jews are killed, 211 are injured. In May of 1921, there are bigger Arab anti-Zionist riots in Jaffa, and they spread out. The Arabs are going through the streets. They're attacking Jewish homes and businesses. They're like pogroms, right? 47 Jews are killed in May of 1921. Many, many more are injured. Now the British intervene, and this is their mandate now, right? So they intervene and they defend Jews, and 48 Arabs are killed by the British. The British declare a state of emergency, and they say, we need to figure out what's going on here. And they create this commission, the Haymarket Commission, to figure out what's causing this. I thought everything was fine in Palestine. That's what they're thinking. What's happening here? Right? So they just got this property and now all of a sudden it's a hotbed. And the Haycraft Commission basically says the Arabs started it, but it's really because we got too many Jews coming in. The immigration is the problem. So what do the British do? They decide that they should stop Jewish immigration. In 1929, there's even more violence, this time over a religious conflict over the Western Wall in Jerusalem, and this explodes. Arab riots against Jewish communities, not just in Jerusalem, but all throughout. And this is really important because hundreds of Jews and Arabs are killed. This is really bad. And the worst violence is in Hebron and Safed and in Jerusalem. The Jewish community in Hebron has to leave. The Jewish community in Gaza has to leave because of this violence. They are run out of those places. The British are telling them they have to leave for their own safety, and they don't come back for a long time. So I want to just put a thumbtack in that, right? Hebron becomes an Arab area after these riots in 1929. Yeah? Did someone say something? I forgot.
It was me. I found it. I'm looking in the book.
Okay. What did you say?
Nothing. I'm okay.
Oh, are you looking in the book for where I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm. Page 8.
Okay. Great. All right. So, and then again, another commission is set up. This time, the Shaw Commission basically says the same thing the Haymarket Commission said, that the problem is immigration is just too much. It's too much. So the Passfield White Paper, which is like it's got like a foreign policy statement, got like legal implications, in 1930 stipulates that Jewish immigration to Palestine has to be limited. Meanwhile, you got this new form of Arab nationalism that's centered around Islamic identity. Sheikh Qassam says that the problem is not just the Zionists, it's also the British. And by the way, he's also uniting the peasants, the young penniless peasants throughout the Palestinian area, who are pissed off at the lack of leadership from the landholding notables, the elites. And so he's a Muslim cleric, he's a radical, and he says, we can't cooperate with the British or the Zionists. And, Husseini, who was being promised to be in charge of this brand new Arab caliphate by the British, is partnering with British. So he's criticizing Husseini for being co-opted by the British. And he says, we need to confront the British. The British are the problem. And we have to overthrow their mandate. And this is the only way to do that is armed resistance. So now you got an Islamic jihad against the British. Sorry, just to get us back to where we're talking about here, right? So some of the most violent outbreaks start here and just spread out from here. Now, I want to take a few more minutes and just talk about the building of institutions in Palestine before World War I, before the independence of Israel. We'll skip through this, okay? Bottom line, right? The Zionists are far more successful in building these institutions. So after the second Aliyah, Ben Gurion founds Achdut Ha'avadah, the Unity of Labor movement, the Labor Party, which is a way to centralize. So Ben Gurion's one of my, I think he's just really politically just super brilliant, right? So he figures out there's all these sort of kibbutz movements and different kinds of labor Zionists all over, and he creates a unifying organization, Adut HaAvodah. And then later, he creates the Histadrut, which becomes the main labor union of the Yishuv. You might have heard of Histadrut, right? It still exists.
So, Scotty,
yeah,
it's Histadrut.
Histadrut. Now, when I talk to Mexican American students at Cal State Fullerton, they never correct my Hebrew. They're like, can you go slower when you say that? Okay, thank you, Rabbi Marsha. I appreciate that. So in 1921, the British created their Knesset, the Israeli Assembly, as the legislative body for the Jewish community under the mandate. And 9 years later, in 1930, Ben-Gurion creates the Labor Party, Mapai, M-A-P-A-I. Did I say that wrong too, Marcia? Which becomes the dominant political party in the Yishuv, and of Israel, all the way until the 1970s, until Menachem Begin in 1977, they control Israel, Mapai, the Labor Party. So that was very quick to say this is an effort by Ben-Gurion to build some centralizing institutions, political, labor union, a representative assembly. It's all happening, right? And last piece, military. You don't have a government without a military. So all of this, one way to think about this is before there's a state, there are these proto-state institutions that are ready to go, right? Legislature, political party, labor union, and now a military, the Haganah, right? The defense. Founded in 1920, was a secret Zionist militia that was set up to respond to the Arab riots of 1929. They become this, respond to the Arab riots of 1920. Then by 1929, they become this, this significant armed force by 1930. Now in 1931, some of the Haganah members left because they felt like they didn't like the Ben-Gurion was too willing to accept a partition. We'll talk about all that in a minute. The Zev Jabotinsky, who I mentioned last week, the revisionist Zionist, created a more hardline military unit, the Irgun, much smaller, much more militant, much more aggressive. In terms of beyond all that, then there's also educational institutions that were set up. Hebrew University was created in 1925. The Technion was created in 1924. Politically, outside of the state of Israel, you have the World Zionist Organization in Europe advising the mandate government on Britain, on the Yeshuv's major economic, social, and other kinds of affairs. And in 1929, the Jewish Agency is established to replace the World Zionist Organization. They're still there as well. So a lot of effort to create state institutions that are still around, right? Contrast that with the Palestinians. The Palestinians in 1922, the British Mandate government says to the Palestinians, why don't you have a legislative council? The Knesset's there. Why don't you have one too? Your Knesset, your legislative council will just basically have to follow the mandate rules, but you'll have a representative assembly, and you can pass your own laws. Those laws will have to be subject, just like the Yishuv Knessets are, to be approved by the British High Commissioner. The Palestinians refuse. It's Sharif Haj al-Husseini who says no, because first of all, we would be only a minority on that council. And we're the 90% of the population in this area. We should be 90% of the population on that council. So they boycott it, and they boycott the council elections. Instead, they decide to form their own Palestinian Arab Congress. but notice this is the Arab Congress, Palestinian Arab Congress, which meets 7 times between 1919 and 1928. It's not just for Palestine, it's Transjordan, it's Lebanon, it's Egypt, right? The Arab Executive Committee, the AEC, becomes the de facto organization created by this Congress that the mandate authorities, the British mandate, deal with. When they want to deal with who represents the Palestinians, they deal with this broader group that represents Arab nations all throughout the area. Now, the Arab Executive Committee was dominated primarily by, you guessed it, the former landowners, the people who had their power from the Ottoman Empire, the office holders, and they are kind of moderate. They would like to actually make a deal with the British mandate. So they're the main representative for the Palestinian interests, including their reaction to the Balfour Declaration. The AEC is both an executive organization and a legislative organization. They can issue resolutions and send envoys to other nations. The Third Palestinian Congress meets in December of 1920, and it calls for a Palestinian national government accountable to an elected parliament. And that Palestinian Arab Congress, which is now representing, in the fifth time they meet, they reject a British proposal to set up a mandate legislative council. And the main thing they say is, look, if we accept the British mandate, then we accept the Balfour Declaration. So if we say yes to the British saying we'll have a legislative council for Palestine, then we're saying yes to the British mandate, and then we're saying yes to the Balfour Declaration. And this land is all ours. It's not, right? You can't, the British have come in here and they're going to tell the Jews that they can have their country here, and we are not going to cooperate with this. Now, there's also a split between two main leadership groups. I've talked already about Sharif al-Husseini. He's sort of the more radical Palestinian leader who's absolutely no way, I'm not dealing with the British at all. And then there's Raghib al-Nashashibi, who says, well, maybe we should, just, set up a legislative council and have some, representation and be able to talk to the mandate and have some, say about what's happening to our people here. They only agree on one thing. They agree that they don't like Zionism and that they don't want the Jews to take over. But Nashashibi is convinced that by playing nice with the British will eventually come around to the Arab position and back off this Balfour Declaration. Haj Amin al-Husseini is convinced that you can't do business with the British. They've already betrayed us once. They're going to betray us again. So ultimately, the final revolt that I want to talk about here is in 1936. Begins as a strike, a general strike. Haj Amin al-Husseini is sort of in charge of this. That strike basically has two demands. One, no more land sales to the Jews. And two, no more Jewish immigration. Now look at the year.
Yeah.
1936, right? The Jews are trying to desperately get out of Europe, out of Germany, and when they get, the ones that are already arriving this is a very serious revolt. This is a very violent revolt. hang on a second. I'm going to show you a couple pictures of this Arab revolt. It sweeps through the whole area. Thousands of people are dying. Now, Hitler's rise to power, of course, leads to this largest ever wave of Jewish immigration, the Fifth Aliyah. And at the exact same time, you have the largest rebellion by the Palestinian local Arab population. I should have mentioned that the 1936 revolt that goes from 1936 to 1939 is triggered when Al-Qassam, the Sheikh Al-Qassam that I mentioned before, the Muslim cleric, was killed by the British in a clash near Jenin in 1935. The moderates and the Arab Executive Committee completely lose control over the public. And the youth-led movement erupts in this strike and then this violence all throughout. Attacks are against Jewish civilians, but they're also against British soldiers. And the British really clamp down hard, really hard, right? They're not involved in a war right now. And 5,000 Arabs are killed, 415 Jews are killed, 101 British are killed. But in the end, so in some ways, the Arab strike is successful because in 1939, the British say, okay, we've had enough. You guys, this is impossible. We can't deal with this, right? And so in 1939, they issue the Passfield white paper, which says the Balfour Declaration could not have intended that Palestine should be converted into a Jewish state against the will of the Arab population of the country. And they, more importantly, they end in 1939, they clamped down very severely on immigration into Palestine. The other piece of this is that 10% of the population of Palestine, Arab population of Palestine, was either killed, injured, detained, or exiled, including Haj Amin al-Hussein, who basically he was going to be arrested, but he runs away to Syria. Hussein goes to Syria. I'm going to stop showing my goes when he's in Syria, realizes that the British can't be trusted, and he makes a terrible error, or whatever, however you want to look at it. Let's put it this way. And he decides to go to Germany and meet with Adolf Hitler. Hitler didn't, say that they were going to promise a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Hitler didn't take our land. Hitler wants to protect Arabs and provide for them to have the control of their own land. It's only the British and the French that decided they were going to divide up the Ottoman Empire for themselves. And so obviously, this is a terrible mistake in many, many ways. And since I'm at the end of the class, I'll just say this. As the world, and we'll talk a lot more about this next week, as the world starts to see the horrible crime of the Holocaust emerging in bits and pieces, sympathy for Jews, the Jewish problem and anti-Semitism and a need to establish a homeland in Israel for the Jews in the world escalates. The fact that the most visible Palestinian Arab leader, Haj Amin al-Husseini, is now openly allied himself with Adolf Hitler, diminishes his appeal worldwide. Prior to that, there had been a growing appreciation of the needs of the Arab community in Palestine, in London, in France, appreciation and concern about why, Jewish immigration there, and that this wasn't right. And right at that Arab revolt in 1936 to 1939, there was a moment when the British had backed off and said, no more Jewish immigration. We're not going to promise the Jews a homeland there. The Arabs had kind of gone far away, but then Haj Amin al-Husseini's move to be connected with Hitler was just on so many levels, just a horrible tragedy. It also convinced the Zionists that this is not just a competition for land, that their enemy wanted to annihilate them.
Mm-hmm.
And that any statements to the contrary, this was evidence. Ben Gurion and Chaim Weizmann, they knew what was happening, and they were desperate to get as many Jews out of Europe into Palestine as possible quickly. And when Britain stopped in 1939, they snuck in more Jews anyway, but it was very, very difficult. I'll say one other thing, that Ben Gurion also recognized that the Haganah and the Irgun, which were mostly designed as police forces to help the Jews in Palestine guard against Palestinian Arab violence against Jewish communities, had to start to transition in themselves in the mid-1930s, late 1930s, to become a military force. That Ben Gurion already understood that sooner or later there's going to be a war, and starts to build that military. So they start to steal arms from the British during World War II. So what Ben Gurion says is, first we have to fight the war on behalf of the British, like there is no white paper, meaning the 1939 white paper. And then we have to establish the Jewish immigration into Palestine like there is no white paper. What happens from here on is going to be very quick into the 1948 war. But I think you can see from this that both the Palestinians community, Arab community, who see themselves as sort of becoming a victim as Jews are coming in from Europe and expanding, that the British kind of are favoring the Jewish community with this Balfour Declaration. They're also failed by their own leadership, who decide that they don't want institutions of governance, that they will reject any connection to the British. Rashid Khalidi, who wrote a brilliant book, he's he established the Institute for Palestinian Studies at Columbia University, definitely not a Zionist. That's like the understatement of the year. He wrote a book about basically assessing why the Zionist movement was so successful, and the Palestinians really failed to stop it. And one of the things he concluded was this failure of leadership was so profound that there was an opportunity, particularly in 1936, to strike this. Now, I haven't even mentioned the Peel Commission, which in 1937 proposed for the very first time a partition plan. 2 states. 1937, the British said, we can't deal with this. You guys are fighting. How about, you can't live together? Okay, the Jews, you get one part of the country, and here, I'll show it to you real quick, because I forgot to say this. Here it is. So this is the Peel Commission plan. The Jews would get this area, this green area. The Arabs would get all of this. And this would essentially be linked to Transjordan in a confederal situation. And Jerusalem and this whole area to Tel Aviv would be international. It would still be under the mandate, under Britain. Now, the Jews basically said, okay, we'll take it. The Arabs said, no way. And that's just the first of 3 more times when that happens. But you can see that there was this effort. Now, the other thing I'll just say at the end is that there's a tremendous inequality between the Jewish capacity to build state institutions and the Arab society capacity to do that. There's economic inequality, there's educational inequality. A lot of the Jews that came into Palestine from Europe were literate, well-educated, particularly the last wave. You had a lot of engineers and business people. And then you had capital coming in from the World Zionist Organization and the Jewish Agency to help the Jews in Palestine build a stable and prosperous community, where the Arabs were not able to agree on this. First of all, they reject these legislative institutions. They are having more dissension among themselves than the Zionists are having among themselves, which is saying a lot, because there's a lot of dissension among the Zionists between Zev Jabotinsky and Ben Gurion, for example. But even while the Palestinians are actually better educated than their surrounding Arab neighbors, Arab Palestinians who live in that area are economically better off than the Turks or the Iraqis or the Egyptians, according to research by Rashid Khalidi. And yet, but compared to the Jewish population, there's a tremendous gap. And in part, that is one of the reasons why the Yishuv is better prepared to take advantage of offers from the Western world for governing their own state. So let me just stop there, and I'll take about 5 to 10 minutes of questions. And I'm sorry it was a little rushed at the end.
Scott, I have just a quick.
Well, hang on one second, Stacia. Sorry, I'm just kidding. Because I see Debbie raising her hand, and I'm going to let her jump in first, and then you can go, Jim, after that.
It's completely different. When you were talking about how would the Palestinians view the Jews, I just think of people in Texas and the Mexicans wanting to come over the border and how they react. It's just like, we're all these people, you know?
Yeah, I mean, except that here's the big difference is that in Texas, the Americans have a lot of, are you talking about right now?
Yeah,
you talking about,
like when people, like you said, like people feel like they're taking over or something, you know?
Yes, but the United States has complete territorial sovereignty and power and wealth.
Right.
And the Arabs don't really understand, like, this concept of a nation is a brand new concept, like with borders and governance, and you got leadership that is divorced from the public. And so they feel very victimized and threatened. But yes, I think you're right. I think you're right. This feels
personal
like
level. Yeah, you know. Yeah, that was it. My little comment.
I'm sorry, Jim. Go ahead. I didn't mean to make you feel bad.
Oh no, not at all. Didn't make me feel bad at all. I think one of the things too. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned the leadership issue that on the Arab side. I mean, it's just. There's never been a cohesive voice. But the other thing I think is important, that this was the last hope. Israel, the idea of Israel. It's been, centuries, millennia of death and destruction, and this is it, right? There is a sense that if we don't get, if we can't figure this thing out as a homeland, there's nowhere else to go. The world has made it very clear, nobody wants the Jews. Nobody wants us. So where do you go? So we have to go make our own place.
Yeah, no, and you're right.
I mean, so there was just a sense, for me, it seems like there's just a sense of absolute this is it. No more chances. You get one more opportunity. And
yeah, the Jewish
don't
leadership
think that has
understands
changed, to tell you the
this
truth.
is an existential issue.
Mhm.
If we don't have this, especially what's happening with Nazi Germany, even more so. But even before that, right? Even before that, Herzl sees it that way in 1897, 1980, 96. But certainly during the Holocaust and there's awareness that, you know, we just have to do whatever we can to get this set up. Now, the other thing I should say on the flip side, relative to the failures of leadership on the Palestinian side, you have these brilliant leaders on the Jewish, on this, in terms of the Zionists, between Chaim Weizmann finding a way to like convince the British in 1917 to promise the Jews that they'll have their own homeland by positioning the Jewish community in Palestine as a strategic asset to them in World War I and he's so persuasive, right? And then Ben-Gurion, who figures out a way to unite all these fractious Jews throughout the whole country, and sees 10 years before the war, the 1948 war, that they need to gather a military grade force, and if they have to steal the weapons, they'll have to do that, right? Like he's convinced.
Exactly what I mean by that is that it's almost as if the moment created the leaders, not that the leaders created the moment. It's like, this is it, the best. We have one chance, and everybody came with their best and their brightest. And I don't think on the other side there was ever that sense of urgency. I don't know. I mean,
I think a lot of the Palestinian people, the Arab people who are experiencing this time, we're feeling a sense of urgency and concern. And that's why the 1936 general strike kind of happened, despite the leadership's efforts to try to not have it. I didn't even mention that, but they didn't really want that general strike. So Haj Amin al-Husseini sort of emerges as a leader because he sort of inserts himself on this. But this comes out of out of a grassroots movement. But the leadership isn't able to make use of that in a constructive way. And they got an offer, right? They had an offer to their own country in 1937, and they'll get another offer again in 1947. We'll see that.
thank you.
Okay, so maybe what I'll do is on next week is we'll start a little bit to talk about some of the narratives out from this period of time before we go into the 1948 war. So we'll be able to have a chance to unpack that a little bit more than I just did just now. There's also some analysis I wanted to add too. Yeah.
I have one last comment. This is exactly what I wanted to learn. I am so happy I'm taking this class and that you are teaching it.
Oh, I'm glad you feel that way.
Yes, I follow you, Debbie. I second that, Debbie.
Anything, and it's put